Welcome to Relentless Truth with John Warren, the podcast that extracts truth from a wide range of topics, revealing who God is, who we are, and how we relate to each other. Now, here's John with this week's powerful and practical insights.
Welcome to Relentless Truth. I'm John Warren. It's good to be with you. Please like, share, review, and subscribe to The Relentless Truth. For more information, go to our website, johnwarrenmedia.com. You can find us also wherever you go to get your podcasts. My guest today is a very special guest. His name is Josh Shepard. He is a freelance journalist. He writes on culture, faith, and public policy issues for media outlets, including The Roy's Report, Family Theater Productions, Christianity Today, The Stream, The Federalist, and What's on Disney Plus. He's a graduate of the University of Colorado, and he previously worked on staff at the well-known Heritage Foundation and Focus on the Family. You can find him on Twitter at Josh M. Shep. Josh and his wife, Terry, live in the Washington, D.C. area with their son and daughter. Josh, it is such an honor to have you here. Welcome.
John, it's a real pleasure. I've listened to the podcast and thrilled to get to be a guest.
All right. Well, I've got to ask you, because a large segment of this Relentless Truth audience includes young people, and we don't often encounter someone with your experience in journalism. And so I'm wondering, who's also a Christian, and I'm wondering if you would just, I know this can be challenging for a journalist to talk about themselves because that's not what you do, but would you please just share your life story, as much of it as you're comfortable sharing?
Absolutely. John, I kind of have, I think, an unconventional route to doing unconventional work. So I think sometimes you talk to people and you hear about their career path and it's kind of like, oh, well, do exactly what I did because this is the way everyone should do it. And I don't believe that. I think, that God gives us all unique callings and unique paths to where we end up in life. And I think, for me, I've gotten to do this interesting variety of work. I do public policy, kind of writing, as you mentioned. I just did a major story, for instance, on the big Dobbs pro-life court case being heard December 1st. A very big, significant thing happening at the Supreme Court here in the Washington, D.C. area. But I've also, gotten to interview some Oscar-winning actors recently, working on some stories related to some films coming out around Christmas. I'm working on a story about YouTube channels for toddlers. One outlet wants that one. And I'm also working on some Giving Tuesday campaigns for a couple of different nonprofit groups.
Wow.
So, there's a variety of work in there, and it's not all journalism, but that's certainly now the bulk of what I get to do. I grew up certainly with a passion for writing. I was a homeschooled kid in the Texas suburbs. I actually have 10 siblings. So there's 11 kids total then. So you have the girls at the oldest and youngest, and then there's 9 boys in the middle. So we're Dallas area. My folks are still there, and a lot of my siblings are there in the Dallas area. But yeah, it was wonderful growing up, doing chores and all that kind of whole routine that you have as a homeschooled family. And, I think homeschooling sometimes, once you get to learn to read, it can be kind of self-taught to a degree, to a little bit degree. I mean, my dad's a doctor. He's a medical doctor. So he would help us with science and math at night. And my mom was a former English teacher and had done so. I think the reading aspect and other aspects of it, she really was leading on. So it was a wonderful experience. I wrote a monthly newsletter about family events, so you can kind of see my writing experience even from a young age when I was probably, 10 years old. And then as getting into my teen years, I actually interviewed contemporary Christian music artists and I wrote reviews of their albums. And those were published on an early website back in like 95, 96 time frames throughout the late 90s. So it was fun to kind of be part of internet journalism even back then. I went to a couple different schools for college, started at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, finished up at University of Colorado in Colorado Springs because I actually went to what was called, it's an institution that doesn't right now exist, but the Focus Leadership Institute was a one semester program that sort of had their own faculty there at Focus on the Family in Colorado Springs. And so I went to that one fall, I think during my junior year, and I loved it so much and connected there so much that I ended up working for them pretty quickly. And so I ended up transferring over to University of Colorado, UCCS in the Springs, working during the day at Focus and working at night, finished up my degree. So it was great. I managed marketing for Adventures in Odyssey. Got to meet the actors behind the show and still know and in touch with a lot of the producers and people who are just, it's an amazing crew there at Focus. So, and I honestly worked for some people in marketing as well who were top of the line people. They have learned a lot about the whole marketing stuff. So I went from there. I really felt though God calling me, I guess it was in 2008 and 09. I think that's correct. Yeah. As we saw a lot of transition happening in the nation, of course, President Obama and his campaign, I started to get more interested in politics and policy. And so really felt that God was calling me towards this direction of Washington, D.C. So I left my job in 08, I guess it was 09, spring of 09. And people were like, man, we're kind of in the middle of a recession. Is this a good idea? But I knew that, God had called me. He kind of put me some signposts of, for instance, I'd paid off my tuition. I'd paid off my car and some other things. I didn't have any debt. And so was like, okay, this feels like what God's calling me to do, and had some good contacts from Focus, of course, to move into DC. But yeah, arrived out here, did a lot of informational interviews at first, talked to someone at Heritage Foundation early on, and they said, hey, you should go on Capitol Hill, get to know how the legislative process works and that whole process down, of bills and influence and everything that goes on. And then if you try to go off the Hill to Heritage or wherever, you'll be more helpful and more useful to people. So I did that. I worked for 2 different congressional offices, first in an internship and then more of a fellowship that was paid. And then from there, that was about a year or so. And then from there, I worked at Heritage Foundation. So the same person I did the informational interview with, I ended up in their marketing team and communications team. And so that takes us to my time at Heritage, which was about 4 years, and loved it. Ultimately jumped from there to a pro-life organization in the area, especially that was enabling me to do the communications work, because that, really more the writing and reporting and the editing that I enjoyed doing. They had a position open that was like an editorial role, and would be working with about a dozen different writers around the nation, people who are writing about pro-life issues and adoption and foster care. And, certainly they're an anti-abortion group, no question, pro-life, but they saw it, I think, in a broad sense, and they continue to. It's a group Bound for Life that is often praying at the Supreme Court. Yep. If you've ever seen the pictures of the red life tape, folks who pray out there silently, that is Bound for Life. So I worked for them for couple of years, probably 2.5, 3 years, loved it. And then just realized that I could jump into more of a freelance type role through some of the contacts I made, and get to write very broadly about a number of things, and that it could work out well. And that's what I've been doing since that point, which would have been, I think, the start of the Trump administration, so 2016.
16,
if I'm not
yep.
mistaken. Yeah. So spring of 2016. So it's been now 5 years, I guess now, of that sort of work. And that's been great. So
now, how do you I'm going to go back and pick on you for one comment.
Sure.
Kind of a recession, you said, about 2008 and 9. I thought that was funny. That's the understatement of the year. And you had the courage to move from, if I understand it correctly, Colorado Springs to Washington, D.C. during the height of that recession, right?
It's true. Yes.
So,
yep.
I guess youth is enabling in a situation like that. And, a lesson for all of us, and you sort of made this comment sort of parenthetically tangential to your point. You talked about being out of debt, and what I heard you say is, I did the right things financially so that I was nimble and could make that move. And so I don't think the ordinary person could have done so, maybe financially, during that time.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't know that I'm great with money, but and I appreciate speaking. I'm sure we could probably talk on a more financial level about different things I could be doing. But
yeah, well,
and then I do think that the millennial generation it tends to be a little bit risk averse. And that's my generation.
That's true. And that is so true.
And I think that's something we have to deal with. I think it's just a fear issue where we have to take big risks sometimes, and if God calls you to take a big step, then to do it.
Yep.
And, that's the case. We're getting married out here and meeting my wife, and you just have to take risks. And I just, you look at the figures and the social science of lesser dating going on in the millennial generation, lesser ultimately marriages. And
right.
I'm sure there's a number of factors at play there. Fewer people having children now, especially now in this, COVID era, post-COVID, they see that as a great burden and a great cost potentially. But, having come from a large family, my dad always said, God provides, for the next child. And, so I just try to believe that and count on, where the Lord would direct in that regard. So.
Well, what a blessing I did not know the number of siblings that you had, and I did not know that you grew up in what sounds like no household is ever perfect, but the perfect household for homeschooling. You have a dad who's a physician who can cover math and the sciences, and you have a mom who was an English teacher, I believe you said. So, wow, did you have an advantage being homeschooled in that culture, in that environment?
Yeah. No question. I'm very thankful for it. And I think, I don't think homeschooling's for everyone. I'm definitely someone who believes that, maybe even my wife and I, we may pursue private schooling or public schooling for our kids. We're not really there yet. One's 2 and one is 8-9 months here.
Right.
But at any rate, it was a unique blessing for sure.
Well, I want to shift gears and really pick your brain, because it is not a common occasion for me to have as a guest a journalist on Relentless Truth. And I'd love to just get you to talk generally for just a few minutes about the state of journalism in America, because you're uniquely capable of doing this. I want to hear more about what it's like to do the work that you do, where you have some independence and you're working with on different platforms with different companies. And could you just opine a little bit about the state of journalism in America compared to maybe what it once was, and maybe talk about the direction you see it going in?
Sure. Well, I did hear your recent interview with Mr. James Rosen, correct?
Yep.
I'm not necessarily, that's not my degree necessarily in journalism, I will say. And so I have written quite a bit for a number of sites. You mentioned The Stream, The Federalist. There's also a few that might be more, Christianity Today, certainly a very high standard journalism there. Religion and Politics is another one that's a journalism outfit. And I written some larger pieces for them. And those are months long and even year long type research projects sometimes.
Yeah.
Providence Magazine as well. So, I think we've all seen certainly the polarization happen in journalism, no question. I think that the Trump era was certainly a shakeup for a lot of things, and not all of that was in any way bad. I think so as someone who certainly, like I said, has a lot of pro-life convictions and believes in human dignity, you might say from womb to tomb that there were some aspects of policy and things that happened during that era that were extremely positive. I think that in the realm that I'm in, which is conservative journalism to a degree, and also religion reporting, so Christian-based outlets, etc., I think you do see that polarization playing out. There might be different stories that I would have pitched to editors regarding issues of, race and ethnicity and racial reconciliation, and some of the angles I might have that I think would be challenging I kind of saw some rejection on that and didn't always see people want to post that. I did an interview with David French, had the opportunity to talk to him, who is, I think, a very wise man, somebody that we should be tuned into, listening to, and had a hard time getting that published, actually, at some of the outlets that I work with, just because he was at the time, and continues to be, I think, a critic of former President Trump, and, was asking some questions, and I think from a moral viewpoint and a moral lens that we should be considering. So I'm not saying he has all the answers and that, there aren't good rebuttals, I'm sure, to make to those arguments. But I believe the American model is a free marketplace of ideas, and right. I think particularly I would think conservatives should be championing free speech and not trying to shut down perspectives that might make them uncomfortable. And so, I'd actually go to that question of the issues of race and ethnicity. I think it's a really important issue and honestly kind of a blind spot on the right on some of these issues. So, for instance, when I went from Heritage to Down for Life, that was another kind of a risk situation for me. It was leaving a significant paycheck to a group that was smaller and that would be a bit of a cut. But I felt that God was calling me to do that. And, I did that for a few years and actually ended up talking to a pro-life leader named Jill Stanek, former nurse, and I believe she now works with Susan B. Anthony List, but really wise woman who's been in the pro-life movement for a long time. And she had a conversation with me and said, hey, I'm really glad that you left your role at Heritage to invest your talents in the pro-life cause. I really think that your voice matters in this whole thing. And so I feel the same way as I look back on it, on this issue of wanting to elevate and talk about these issues of race and just those entrenched issues that are there and us not always being willing to address them, I don't think, in a really helpful way. So people always ask me, why do you even care about these issues? What were some significant things that have really gotten you interested in the last few years? And one of those was actually over the weekend of July 4th, 2016. So it was a very significant weekend because you had a few different shootings happen of unarmed black men. Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge was one of them, a gentleman named Philando Castile in Minnesota. And so, this was a situation where, both those situations, really the situation with Alton Sterling was first. I believe it was early in the week, like say a Tuesday. And I was looking, and it was just a horrific situation. The video footage was spreading online. And this was, of course, over the July 4th weekend, Independence Day. And so few out, everybody seemed to be on autopilot. I was actually looking for wise Christian voices who cover these issues, Tony Evans or Wellington Boone, or, some of these different Christian voices out there that often do address some of these things and just say, well, where's the voice that's out there talking about it? And everybody was kind of like Happy Independence Day, just had flag waving on their website, kind of unfortunate, and ultimately found a gentleman in Missouri, Jonathan Tremaine Thomas, who is now living in Ferguson with his family, and he had some really wonderful wisdom to share on these issues. But then a few days, the Philando Castile incident happens in Minnesota, and then there starts to be these protests and things happening across the nation. Well, Dallas is where I'm from, and so I was watching the events that occurred Thursday evening of that week, where there was a protest that was peaceful. There was a lone gunman, though, who was, watching this rally from afar, and he shoots down 5 officers, 5 officers in Dallas, downtown Dallas. Just horrific scene. And I have siblings who are both National Guard and military. So this definitely hit close to home. And, to see people in uniform like that gunned down was just horrific. And I do think that President Obama honored their memory well in the speeches that he gave. But the thing was, within the next morning, all across my social media feed, and probably most people who are conservative, it was all Blue Lives Matter. That was the message that was going out. And I just thought, well, we're not addressing those 2 unjust incidents of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile that sparked this in the first place. That's suddenly become, not even talked about and discussed in the midst of these other, murders that have happened. And so I just recall posted something that said, hey, the deaths of these 2 men, Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, they were unjust. And I don't know all the details, and I know investigations are ongoing, but it was just interesting how within a few hours of that, a few friends of mine who were, of minority ethnicity, et cetera, they reached out and said, hey, thank you. They said it means so much more when someone who looks like you says that than, necessarily just coming from the minority community.
Yeah.
And so for me, I began to read more of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., began to read other Christian authors like Jamar Tisby and others, and learned a lot in that space. And I do think it's an issue where there's learning to do, I think, in the majority here. And so I do try to spotlight that where I can and look for places to kind of discuss those issues and open hopefully the gates to say, hey, there maybe are a broader set of voices here that we're not always listening to on these issues. So I hope that answered some of your question. And
it does.
So
well, and don't sell yourself short. You and I bumped into each other when in response to this documentary called Pray Away, and we'll maybe get to that later. But I find you to be, Josh, a very balanced journalist, fair-minded. I know of your very conservative, solid Christian views, but you also take a very good, neutral approach to your journalism. I want to just ask you, though, in the context of some of those posts that you're talking about where you said the right thing and maybe pushed back a little bit on a narrative that often comes from the far conservative right. Have you bumped into along the way any elements of cancel culture? And I didn't have that in my planned list of questions, but it popped into my head as you were just talking. That culture, that's a whole new thing to me, and I find it fascinating. But did you get pushback from another element? I know you said you had a couple people who reached out and commended you, but have you ever experienced that in social media for any position you've taken on anything?
Oh, for sure. No question. I mean, you talk about the Pray Away story, and we could definitely get into that, but that's an issue where you talk about these issues of how some different Christian ministries want to discuss issues of LGBT desires that may be unwanted from certain people, and they, in a counseling level of adults wanting to get counseling, that they would want to, have the freedom to pursue that. And suddenly this is being made illegal. So, I see it from both the right and the left. Like I mentioned, there are some different outlets that have rejected pieces that I've written regarding issues of race and ethnicity because they felt that I elevated maybe some perspectives that made them uncomfortable. But certainly, no question. So that would be on the right. But on the left, there's a number of issues, whether it's the issues of sexuality and marriage. I think really since the Obergefell decision of the Supreme Court, where same-sex marriage was legalized in the nation, the way that Orthodox Christian teaching, would look at the issue of marriage is different than the state now in the United States regards it. And so that creates an inherent conflict. And there are all manner of contexts where that plays out, whether that's adoption services
right.
and, Christian ministries that want to continue to place children with a family that might be with a mother and a father. Obviously the wedding industry, they've had so much issue there. So I see cancel culture operating on both of those. I do think it is good to be distinct and specific about what you're talking about, because it can kind of be painted with a broad brush and say all the left is involved in cancel culture. But I don't think that that's true. I mean, I think,
right.
You look at someone like Robert George and Cornel West who go out and do these events together. Robert George, of course, being on the right and conservative, Cornel West being on the left and very much a liberal, but a classical liberal in the sense that he wants to have an open public square of open debate. And so I think that some of the more troubling aspects of what you might call cancel culture, again, it's not really a term that I don't think I like very much, because I think that it's better to drill down into the specifics.
Right.
I think Amazon, of course, banning books is pretty egregious. That's pretty incredible. I mean, honestly, we could just go through this story of what Anne has faced. And I know you've interviewed her recently, but where her ministry, Restored Hope Network, has been banned from Facebook and banned from Twitter and not able to get on the social platforms.
Yep.
Not even have a page.
Anne is the executive director of, Anne Palk is the executive director of Restored Hope, which is the ministry Josh is referring to there. Yep.
Yeah. So, of course, out of Colorado Springs. And so, those are egregious issues, and it does show you the increasing influence of big tech. I'm very much not a conspiracy theory person. I traffic in that, and especially in the COVID era, I've been one to shoot down a lot of unfortunate anti-vax vaccine and otherwise kind of things that have gone on there. But
you won't see me opining on vaccine mandates or anything of the sort either, for the same reason.
Yeah, but I do. In the case of big tech, I have friends who are had a lot of investment in Silicon Valley and know the complexity of that world and the generations really of work that have gone on since the 80s and 90s in that world, and would say there is absolutely an element here that is trying to shut down the open marketplace of ideas, free speech, etc. And we should be very skeptical about our data that we're giving these companies and using their platforms, etc. So that we should all be very wary of Facebook, Twitter, etc., and realize that there are livelihoods that depend on those platforms, and they can very easily be taken away, by the corporations that are pulling the strings. So
that's exactly right. Well, I want to respect your time, and I'm going to ask you just maybe we could just do a lightning round here, and I want you to take the time to answer thoroughly, but I want to get to a couple of things that we haven't even talked about yet. And one is going to catch you off guard maybe just a little bit, and that is you write for a diverse audience, and you write for independent churches. Your audience includes Baptist, Methodist, Charismatic, Reformed, and Catholic, and sort of everything in between. How do you approach that where you write for such a diverse audience? You have a nice way from a style standpoint. And how do you think about that as you're writing for a broad audience like that?
I appreciate that. Yeah. I think that sometimes being aware of divides is a good way to hopefully respect people on either side of it at first. And so I do see that there are many divides in the church, and even just within the evangelical church, of Baptist, mainline, charismatic, etc. And of course, Roman Catholic. That's been a new thing for me coming out here to the East Coast. Frankly, I mean, I had a few friends growing up who were Catholic, but it's much more dominant here on the East Coast, and especially in this area. And it's like, if you're involved in the pro-life movement, the March for Life is easily 85% Catholic. So if you're going to be involved in that, I've interviewed so many Catholic leaders now since then. So yeah, I think that in a sense, I know what I believe, and I know what my core, beliefs are about the gospel and about ultimate questions.
Right. The essentials, if you will.
Yeah, of theology, heaven and hell, and different things. But I also am respectful of people who have other beliefs. And I think there's an aspect of leaving it to the Holy Spirit to a degree. I think that there is an aspect of where we want to be a witness for Christ and have an answer at the ready when people ask questions.
Right.
But at the same time, it's not necessarily some kind of a promotional campaign. I don't think that God's asking us to put on for the truth. I think that the Holy Spirit is the one who speaks to hearts, and
he doesn't charge us with getting them in a headlock and saying, come over to this position on a worship style issue or some other peripheral issue.
Exactly. And it's interesting because I do think I've learned this quite a bit from my parents, because they have very deep connections in Israel. One of their passions in life is certainly promoting and doing benevolent work on behalf of Israel. And they are deeply involved in the Jewish community in Dallas. They have probably 8 or 10 different rabbis and people that they are very good friends with, and Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, etc., all the different streams of Judaism, they are very familiar with and
right.
great, good, close friends with. And people do question that sometimes. I have seen those conversations happen where people are wondering, are you evangelizing but they're just like, we don't have a hidden agenda. And, when we're asked questions, we are the first to answer those. But they just really love people and love relationship and, believe that the image of God is in every person and that God is doing miracles. And we don't always know the larger story that God's telling, but, they'll be very firm to say that people come to salvation through Jesus Christ alone. They're not in any way preaching some different gospel, but I think there's an aspect of, like you say, leading into the Holy Spirit there. So I hope that.
Yeah, that does.
Some of that.
Yeah, that's just
also,
helpful perspective. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I do think that there is a lot to learn, and the more we learn, the more we can be respectful. So I try to learn about the Baptist denomination. I certainly have. Part of my advantage, I think, is that frankly, we went partly to Baptist churches when I grew up. We went to some Methodist churches. We went to all flavor of non-denominational churches and charismatic. And so I have seen church done in a lot of different ways and in terms of evangelical and now even Catholic. So maybe that helps to a degree that I've had that broad experience.
Well, just to quickly reveal my inner geek, I want to know, I visited DC several times, and usually that was typically during my banking career. My daughter and I went on a senior trip there for her and looked at all the tourist areas. But usually I would just go right in and go right to the Department of Treasury and try to get them to do something related to something in some policy issue relative to banking. But as a journalist, DC seems like a harsh place. And you've been there for a while. What's that like to work there in DC? Live and work there?
Yeah, DC is certainly kind of a dog-eat-dog world. I almost feel like because I was on Capitol Hill, Heritage Foundation, their offices are right there, near the Supreme Court, went on there every morning for those 4+ years that I worked there. And so it is, I think it's a difficult place to get around to a degree. You have to use the metro, and parking and all that is a disaster. And it is a very competitive world. When I did that year and a half or so on Capitol Hill, even just among fellowship and interns, I think I kind of turned heads because people were like, well, you're like, goodness, what is it, 25, 26, and you're, doing this fellowship thing that's,
right.
And I'd saved up, and so it was able to pay my bills or whatever, but they were like, what are you doing here? And so there is a competitive environment here. There is a environment of, we have to get the scoop and be the first to print rather than get the details. That's certainly, I think, the case with a lot of journalism, and I think especially as journalism has moved online, that being the first, being the scoop is the all-important thing, more so than always getting the details right. So right. I tend to be one who wants to get the details right and tell it a little slower, tell it in a way that's going to, get you the right perspective and the right color to the story. So, yeah, I guess I'm just thankful that I have been with the outlets that I'm at right now, and I get that opportunity to tell a lot of different stories. Well, have that variety, and also, have gained some of the contacts that I've gained that, that enable me to kind of hopefully tell a different perspective sometimes than you get always. So,
well, speaking of your work, I want to pick your brain because this is a selfish question. I'm going to geek out for a minute and ask you. I'm interested in your writing on films and TV, and you do a lot of work there. You're an expert on this topic, and this is a question that I hear. I hear this sentiment from my students and their families, and I have this question myself. Where do we go? Where do Christian families who care about family films, as I think I mentioned to you before, I'm not exactly a Quaker, but I like to have a resource to find good films. Where do we go to do that? Give us some resources or some thoughts there, and talk about your top 5 films from this past year, just quickly, if you would.
I'd love to. Thank you, John, for that. And we say that culture is upstream of politics. That it's ultimately
Indeed.
These ideas of that we see in the films and in storytelling that kind of filter down ultimately to politics. And so you can play at the back end of the process and just look at laws and look at court cases and things. But I tend to think, okay, the ideas of stories and of what we're seeing in film and TV today are probably going to ultimately play out in the coming years. And so, I write about movies and TV so that I can write about any topic and any issue imaginable because these all play out on the screen. And so I love that I get to do that. And a few resources I would point people to before launching into my own little list of top 5 here would be, let's see. So I used to work for Focus on the Family, and I wrote actually a little bit for Plugged In, and that's still a wonderful outlet. They do great work there. I know that people just think, oh, well, they're just, looking at the content and how many swear words or whatever were said. And it's not really true if you look at their reviews, especially once you get down to kind of the bottom after they give you the list of content, then they're going to give you a conclusion. Yeah. And those paragraphs are always the ones to kind of look at and understand, okay, how are things playing out? And they have a lot of very serious people who know film review, people who worked at other publications and do call out a lot of interesting themes and aspects of filmmaking and TV work and what they do. So I love that outlet. Still definitely watch what they do. And I think it's helpful to understand where there's concerns from a family standpoint.
Right.
Decentfilms.com is another great site that's run by Stephen Greatanus, who is a Catholic film reviewer. But he's in the National Critics Registry, I think is what it is. But he's sort of very much a prominent reviewer on the faith side of things. And there's very few of his that I disagree with. He's a very serious reviewer. He's somebody I've frankly learned from, I think, just by reading his material about cinematography, about a number of things. So decentfilms.com, and he writes for so many outlets. He kind of collects it all there, and you can go out and find it. In terms of the top 5 films of 2021 so far, of course, I hope to get to a top 10 list, but we're still seeing what's going to play out here over the Christmas season. I think there's a number of good ones coming out, but I'll start us out with number 1, which I believe is Blue Miracle. This is a film that's on Netflix. Really rare for Netflix to fund something like this. There's a faith and family film like this. If you've not seen it, it is really, really good. A story of foster care and adoption that takes place in Mexico, was filmed out there, parts of it, and then was also filmed in the Caribbean. But Dennis Quaid stars in it. There's also a young star named Jimmy Gonzalez who really kind of carries it, Latino man, and really deals with this orphanage there and this boat kind of competition that occurs of a fishing competition where, they go out and ultimately, if they can, catch get the big one, bag the big one, this essentially team of orphans. And then you have this with Jimmy Gonzalez, who is kind of their orphan care kind of director. Dennis Quaid in the film is this kind of old, grizzled, fisherman who doesn't, but is kind of forced into this situation with them. And basically they kind of go out together and ultimately bag this, a massive, marlin fish. So it's beautifully told, really some unexpected twists in that movie. So Blue Miracle, one you really should see. To keep going down the list here. And streaming is kind of my focus. So you'll see a lot of streaming services for sure, but there's a couple that are theatrical. Luca is on Disney Plus, latest from Pixar, great coming of age story, a little bit of fantasy in there, but mostly it's really just a story of friendship. And I think what's fun about this film is that, there's not a superhero or a princess or a wizard anywhere in sight in this movie. It's just about 2 boys and their friendship, and there's this young girl as well who they become this sort of triad of friends and defeating the bully. And it's a fun little small town story. It's from an Italian director, and it really celebrates the Italian culture in a really beautiful way. So definitely would very much suggest Luca if you haven't seen it. I think a lot of people probably who are families have. Third would be The Courier, which is on Prime Video, so Amazon Prime Video. This is a great film. Got very little attention, but it's just a great spy thriller. This is with Benedict Cumberbatch, and it takes place in the Cold War era. Cumberbatch is actually a businessman who gets recruited into basically the CIA and MI6 to kind of spy on the Russians and do this covert operation during the Cold War era. Really well told story. The third act of that movie just kicks into a whole different gear. And so it's a very different story almost once you get to the third act of it. But, just a powerful story, and I think if you love kind of classic historical stuff, that's great. 4, I would say, is In the Heights. This is kind of the year of musicals, you might say. I think maybe 10 musicals or so, 8 or 10 musicals released this year. It's ridiculous. So in my opinion, I think this is probably the best of them. Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical that was written before and done before Hamilton, which is a film that I love and a musical that I love. But this is a great one that really spotlights Latino culture, gives you the sort of variety and flavor of that plays out in Washington Heights in New York City. Beautiful story of kind of a love story that plays out, but also a story about family and about intergenerational sort of stuff. I mean, honestly, Lin-Manuel had multiple musicals. There's another one called Vivo that was an animated one that's on Netflix, and it plays out similar. You can kind of see almost the influences of In the Heights in that animated version. But I think this is a great movie. You really should go and see it. It's on HBO Max. Just a great musical. Number 5 would be Respect, which is the Aretha Franklin story. Yep. Issues of race and ethnicity play out there. And frankly, issues of church abuse and spiritual abuse and a lot of interesting things. I wrote about this for the Royce Report for Julie Royce, who is an editor that I work with closely. So such an important film, and I think it didn't get the notice that it deserves, but it's a movie that people should check out. There's a movie coming out on Christmas that I do want to mention that is called American Underdog. The Irwin brothers, who are this great, these guys who've done several movies like I Still Believe and I Can Only Imagine. They were given a 4 times bigger budget than they've ever worked with. And they've got big stars, Zachary Levi, who is known as the superhero Shazam, who plays Kurt Warner in this film. And then Anna Paquin, who's an Oscar winner, plays his wife, Brenda Warner. So this is a great inspirational movie. I think it's going to be huge, and it's going to elevate their work, I think, to a much greater audience. So that's out on Christmas, American Underdog. Folks should see it. I plan to go with my family. We've already got to see it early, but it is a very, very good movie. That's Kurt Warner's whole journey into the NFL. So
yep, that's a great story. Josh, thank you. I have taken more of your time than I should have. I appreciate your generosity. I can hear the passion in your voice when you talk about these movies, and I appreciate so much I've just got to say this, the principled approach you take, the values that you personally have, and yet the balanced approach that you take as you let them inform your work. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, look up Josh Shepard, follow him on social media. He's a blessing to many of us who've gotten to know him and his work. So thank you for being here. It's been a rich blessing.
I appreciate it, John. Love the podcast. I'll keep listening. And, folks can find me at Josh and Shep on Twitter. I have a page on a site called Authory, so you can kind of see all my work there and even get like a weekly email that goes out with my work. So
terrific.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. And folks, if you would like, share, review, and subscribe to Relentless Truth, we will resume our discussion of the economy next time. Quite a change from this rich blessing we've had with Josh. We'll go back to talking about economic indicators and how they inform our lives. So it is good to be with you. For more information, please go to our website, johnwarrenmedia.com. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Relentless Truth with John Warren. Please consider sharing this podcast and subscribe to receive future episodes. Connect with John regarding your comments, questions, and show ideas through johnwarrenmedia.com or at John Warren Media on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. That's all for this episode. Join us next week for another edition of Relentless Truth with John Warren.